Welcome, everyone, to the next in our series of our image processing workshops for the Central Florida Astronomical Society. My name is Frank Kane, the current president of CFAS. If you're watching this and you're in the Orlando region, do consider joining us at cfas.org. That's cfas.org. Link in the description and whatnot. But with that, let me hand it over to one of our stars of astrophotography. Oh, I didn't mean to do that pun. John Starr is going to be teaching us about one-shot color astrophotography processing with PixInsight. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Frank.
Yep.
Let me share my screen here real quick. Bring up, I did a couple slides here just to sort of level set us, and I'll go through what we're going to be talking about sort of tonight. So specifically, I'll go through sort of processing narrowband images with a one-shot color camera. The particular camera I'm using is actually this one that you see up on the screen now, which is the ASI 533 MC Pro, which is a very, very common sort of beginner camera. I've been using it for years. I still use it. I think it's fantastic. But this also applies to anyone that has sort of color raw images. We're going through that, and specifically if you're using sort of a dual multi-narrowband filter. So with that, the only real difference between sort of a color camera and a mono camera is that the color camera has something called a Bayer matrix, sort of a filter laying on top of it that sort of separates automatically for you the light into red, green, and blue. There's a quarter of it is red, quarter is blue, and 2/4 or a half is green. And so because of that, you have to go through an algorithm called demosaicing, which essentially puts everything in the right place so that you have sort of a color image. And so that's quickly kind of what we're talking about. The interesting thing is that the sensor itself is the same sensor. It just has this Bayer matrix laid on top of it. So an example of kind of what we're talking about here is on the left is taken with a one-shot color camera, specifically the ASI 533 MC Pro. And the right is taken with sort of a mono camera, ASI 2600. And so on the left, this is sort of a synthetic Hubble palette, which is what we're going to be doing tonight. The right is sort of processed using sort of the sort of narrowband, typical narrowband processing, where you map the sulfur, the hydrogen, and the oxygen to the red, green, and blue. Over here, this was taken with the one on the left here, the OSC. That's essentially taken with I believe it was an L extreme. And so essentially you've got the hydrogen and the oxygen. And then going through the process that we're going to follow tonight, you can get something like this. So there's lots of different multi-band pass filters. There's dual narrowband, which is 2, which is obviously the most common and also pretty reasonably priced when it comes to filters. But there's also quad band, right? So there's multiple bands here. This is the one on the left is sort of the Optimum L Ultimate, which is the successor to the L Extreme. The data that I took and that we'll process tonight, that was taken with the L Extreme. But Saboni, Antlia, ZWO, they all have their own sort of version of these. The prices can vary pretty wildly depending upon how narrow your band of light is, and so ranges everything from 3 nanometers, which is a bit on the expensive side, to as high as 35, which I think the ZWO is 35. So a lot of them, the Antlias and those, are somewhere in the 3 to 7 typically. So again, just highlighting the differences between natural and color. So when you take a one-shot color image, I used a dual narrowband filter. This is the exact same data right here. So this is the Pac-Man Nebula, and the one on the left was processed exactly like the one on the right, except for one pretty important difference, right? And we'll go through that tonight. But that one difference, which is essentially creating a synthetic channel because you don't have sort of the sulfur. And so you're kind of making a synthetic green channel. And when you do that, you can kind of get this really neat replica, if you will, of sort of the Hubble palette. But other than that, this is the exact same data processed the same way. I processed them both at the same time in preparation for this talk tonight. And all I did was I just changed one thing to get the image on the right. So it's completely up to you. I still like to process, sort of leaving things alone, if you will, and leaving them sort of this nice red. But sometimes it is fun to kind of do this this sort of Hubble palette on the right. There's a bunch of stuff, a lot of tools that we're going to be using. These are all the ones that I use. There's the ones at the top, and I'll have a link. I have a text file that I can drop in a shared folder if anybody wants to copy and paste these. But these are the ones that I'll go through tonight. I've separated into two categories because all the ones up top here are free, which is fantastic. The ones below are paid, and so they range from 60 to $100 here. I think others that have kind of done talks, Wes and Frank, when they did their talks, and I will reiterate, if you're going to buy one, buy this one right here, this blur exterminator. It's amazing what it can do. It definitely will improve your images. The other two, star exterminator and noise exterminator, we'll go through both of those this evening. I'll talk about those. I'll show how they work, but there's other alternatives that you can use for both of these, and so they're not strictly necessary. I do recommend picking up either Graxpert or StarNet or something like that if you decide not to purchase these. But these are definitely part of my workflow, and I think most folks part of their workflow is to use either these tools or something similar to them. Now, the one that I've highlighted at the top, Cosmic Photons, this is the one, this is narrowband normalization. This is the tool that we're going to use to create that synthetic green and in order to get that Hubble palette. And so it's absolutely necessary to either do this or you can use pixel math. And if you use pixel math, which is fine, essentially you're doing a lot of formulas. You're typing in a lot of formulas in order to do the same thing and creating that channel. This is a couple clicks and it kind of does it for you, and it lets you sort of move some sliders around so that you can get it like you want. I am going to talk briefly about stacking. More so that it can be all inclusive. I know that probably everybody knows how to do this by now. I'm gonna use a different process. I'm not gonna use weighted batch preprocessor. I'm gonna use sort of fast batch processing. It takes about a minute and a half versus 40 minutes or so. I'm gonna use subframe selector to sort of select out sort of the best, if you will, the best files to use, because it takes a minute or so to do that. And I can do that a lot faster than weighted batch preprocessing. Now, I do use WPP. I think it's fantastic, but it takes a long time. And for this data, I think doing an alternative way, I think not only is it fast, but also I don't think it degrades the value of the end product very much. So I am going to go quickly through that tonight. Here's sort of the workflow in PixInsight that I typically follow. It's pretty much the same as most folks that process their stuff. There's a couple things in here I'll call your attention to, and I'll go through all of these steps and walk through why I'm doing them and what you might run into and things like that. I'm obviously gonna to review the data. So I do, sometimes I have 300, 400 images, right? And I go through every one and look at all of them. I think that's a good process to get into. It's time consuming, but I think that's still worthwhile to do. I've already done that tonight. We're not gonna sit here and scroll through all these files, but I think it's important to do, and then either use weighted batch or do subframe selector or something like that to sort of carve out others. Obviously, we'll do a stretch, a screen transfer function, which is sort of like a stretch, so we can see what we have. We'll crop the image. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do gradient correction. I'll talk briefly about them, but I'm going to use one. We'll just pick one and we'll use it. I'll use blur exterminator. You don't have to do this if you don't have blur exterminator. Obviously, skip it. Blur exterminator didn't exist for a long time for most of us, so that's okay. I'm going to stretch my data using a statistical stretch script that SETI Astro put out. There's lots of different ways to stretch it. This is because I can do it pretty quick and it's easy, and I get pretty consistent results. I also don't have to do linear fit or anything like that. So I'll use this statistical stretch script. You can use noise exterminator or Graxpert. I like to do it after the stretch, which is a little controversial. A lot of people like to do it before they stretch. I typically will do it after. I do it sometimes before, and then I look and see how it came out, and then I might do it after. So I typically only do it once, and I normally do it after. And then if I have to tweak noise, then I sort of do it sort of near the end. But there's no right or wrong way, in my view, to do it. But I sort of do it after the stretch. But I definitely want to do that before I do some of these other processes. I'll pull the stars out. I'll correct the stars because there's always some green in there, and so we'll pull the green out using SCNR. I'll invert the image so to get the magenta out. So we'll get our stars looking right, and we'll sort of set that aside. And then this is where the magic happens, narrowband normalization. So we'll walk through that tool and how to use it and get our image looking like sort of a Hubble type image. And then after that, there's just some fine tuning. Sort of we'll add some contrast using some of these tools. We'll saturate the image. We'll put the stars back. And if we have to adjust the stars in terms of they're too bright or not bright enough, then we'll do that. But we'll just do some fine tuning at the end. Then we can save it off as a JPEG and crop it and send it to our friends or whatever we want to do. Now that's where we can stop, but I won't. So I will go to over here to Photoshop, and so on 100% of my images, I typically bring them into Photoshop at this point. You don't have to do that. I recognize not everybody has Photoshop. Some people might only have Photoshop, but I almost always bring them over to Photoshop and do a handful of things if they need it. And I'm talking about very slight. So I'm not radically changing sort of the process, but there are a couple things that you can do in Photoshop that you can do really quick and you can immediately see the results. That takes a couple more steps in PixInsight. You can do everything in PixInsight, and a lot of people do, and I think that's great. I can just do it much faster, and I'm lazy, and so it takes longer to do in PixInsight, and I want to do it faster. So I'll pop it over into Photoshop and do like 2 or 3 things maybe if the image needs it. A lot of it is cropping, rotating, contrast, things like that. You can adjust very precisely how you want the stars to look. If we have time, then I'll pull out a broadband image and we can take a look at a broadband image. I'm not sure that we will. The workflow is almost identical, except for instead of doing sort of narrowband normalization to create that synthetic green, I'll do an image solver and then I'll do some color adjustments. And so other than that, the workflow is sort of very, very similar. Some other things that I'll talk about along the way is sort of process icons and where you find them and how you save them and maybe some tricks and stuff like that. And then I mentioned this before, but there are alternatives to the paid stuff with the exception of Blur Exterminator. I haven't found anything that can do what that does. It's incredible. But in terms of gradient correction and star removal and things like that, there are alternatives. So I will stop that and jump right in unless anybody has any questions off the bat. Nope. Okay, so here's sort of our desktop here. The first thing that I like to do is I like to take a look and see what my images look like. I've already done that in this case where I just use a FITS viewer and go through and look at them. But after that, I use a process called subframe selector. And so if you go sort of processes, all processes, it's right here. And it comes up with sort of these windows. The window on the left is going to show sort of all the data. The window over here on the right is going to be where we load our files. And then the expression editor is where we can sort of add the criteria that we want to follow in order to adjusting out sort of the good and the frames that we don't want to use. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to add my files. And I want to make sure that this drop-down menu here is on measure subframes. And so I'll just click add files. I'll go find my files. It's under Pac-Man. Here's my data. And so open up my lights. And then I'm just going to hit Control A to select them all. And then I'll hit open. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and hit this little round button here. Sometimes it's square. I honestly don't know when they're square and when they're round. I don't know if anybody does. Sometimes it's a preview. Sometimes it's an execute. But we're going to go ahead and execute that. It's going to go through these images pretty quickly. I don't have a whole bunch. I've got 56 images, so not a whole bunch. And it comes up sort of with this graph here Right now, I'm seeing what the graph looks like based on sort of our PSF signal weight. There's a couple things that I like to do. Full white half maximum is the first one, FWHM. And what I like to do is if you look at this graph, you can see sort of the standard deviations. And typically I'd like to stay within 2 standard deviations, meaning anything out here, like these peaks out here, are above those standard deviation. And so I would want to carve those out. I want to make sure that they don't get included. And so I just go to my little expression editor here, and I just type in FWHM. And then I just want to say, I want to approve everything that's sort of below, we'll say 2.1, right? And so I hit sort of 2.1, and then I hit this little button here, and you can see sort of it put little X's on those, right? And so that means that those files will be removed from the files that I'm ultimately going to save. And if you look over here, it says in the top left corner, it says 53 of 56. So right now I've selected 94.6. So I do that, and I will I'll go through and hit an and because I want to add something else. And so I like to do eccentricity. And so I will go over here and I will drop that down, and I'll take a look at this and say, okay, what am I looking at here? I want to stay within 2 standard deviations. And so again, so here I would go sort of 0.7. And so I would say I want to say less than 0.7. So that's all you need to do. It's and then the last one that I do, and so then I sort of click this. I may have misspelled it. Yep, I misspelled it. So let's try that again. Okay, so there you go. And so then right up here at the top, it sort of marked these, right? Those being outside of the 2 standard deviations. And remember, eccentricity is the shape of your stars. So like those egg-shaped stars and stuff like that. So I kicked those out. And then I had a little and sign. So I had 2 ands. So you have to add that if you're going to add more, if you're going to add another line of criteria. The last one that I like to do is stars. Again, I can come over here to eccentricity. I'll bring it down to stars. And what I like to do is I want to make sure there's lots of stars in my images, right? And so if you can look down here, this goes down to 350 all the way to 800. And so I don't have any stars. I mean, so you might have a frame where you only have like 50 stars or 100 stars, and something's going on there, either out of focus or clouds came by or something like that. And so you want those out. And so in this case, there's no reason for me to choose anything because it looks like I've got plenty of stars. All the stars are within a couple standard deviations, so I can sort of delete that. So that's all I do. So that didn't take long. It was pretty quick. What I'll want to do now is I'm going to want to save all those files. And so what I'll do is I'll come down here to output files. Under directory, I'll need to choose the directory that I want. So I want it to be obviously in Pac-Man, and I'm just going to create a new folder. I'm going to say these are my approved files. And so I'll open that up and say, okay, select folder. I go up to the top where it says measure subframes. I move that from measure subframes to output subframes, and then I can kind of click the button to execute. And so what that's going to do now is that's going to copy all the frames that I liked. You can see over here there was 49, 7 were skipped. Those were the 7 that subframe selector sort of kicked out for me. So I'm going to close all this. Let's go and see. Let's see if it did its job here. So I'll go over here to Pac-Man. Here's my data, looking approved, and there's my files. So I'm looking pretty good. I'm going to move my light frames out of here for just a second. And now I've got my sort of files that we just selected. I've got my dark, my calibration frames, and I've got my flat frames. So now what I'll do is go back in here, and I'm going to open up scripts, and I will go to batch processing, and I'm going to go to fast batch processing. And so just for sake of clarity, I think weighted batch preprocessing is the way to go. And I think it's fantastic, and I use it 80% of the time And it will do a lot of this stuff for you because you can set the criteria and weight the images, if you will, by how good the images are. So you don't need necessarily to do the subframe selector because weighted batch preprocessing will not place as much weight on those frames as the ones that are sort of good, right? I'm not going to do that though. It takes a while. It's definitely the process to go, but it takes a while. So I'm going to use fast batch processing. I've already selected out the ones that I didn't really want to use. Let's open this up and then we're gonna stack them sort of real time. So let me just go here, reset. We want to clear file sets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on directory. I'm going to go over here to data. In data, you've got my light frames, which are the approved ones. I've got my darks and my flats. I'll just hit select folder. It's going to load all that stuff in here. What I want to do right away, so I don't forget, is I want to choose my output directory. There's many times I have forgotten to do that and then had to go around and try to find out where I put everything. So I'm just going to go right back here. I'm going to hit new folder. We'll just call it PI stack, if I can spell. Okay, so again, if you look, it says I have 30 dark frames, 30 flat frames, and 30 light frames. And you can see that my dark frames are only 7.38 seconds, and my flat frames are 7.38 seconds. So these are actually dark flats. I didn't take darks. I don't always follow all the rules, so I didn't take darks. You should always take darks. I didn't. I didn't take darks, and I was able to get away with it because the sensors on the cameras nowadays are fantastic, but generally speaking, you should take darks. In this case, I'm using dark flats. I've got sort of my flat frames and sort of I have my light frames here. You can leave, I typically leave everything sort of alone. The only difference, the only one thing that I always check is, and this is really important, if you're using color data, which we all are, then I always enable drizzle. And so that really improves sort of the image quality in my experience. And so I always drizzle, and I set it to 1. So I'm not using like 2 or 3 or whatever times drizzle. All I'm trying to do is improve sort of the quality and the cleanness and reduce some noise. And drizzling that at a scale of 1 sort of does the trick for me. I leave this alone. You can choose the functions. I always leave it on square. And then after that, I sort of run it. And so I would never, ever do this when I'm doing a talk like this. I would never do this in real time if I was using WPPP, but I'm going to do it now. So I'm going to stack the image real time using fast batch. And it should take about 1.5 to 1.45 seconds. It actually takes a little bit longer when I'm on Zoom. So I tried this out earlier this week just to see if it would have a material impact. Because the last thing I'd want to do is tell you guys that it only takes 1.5 and then it take 20 minutes because Zoom or something is using resources. But it goes pretty quick. And so in just a minute here, we'll have this. It would be even faster if we weren't drizzling the image. If you're doing mono and or you're just like in a hurry and you don't want to take the extra minute or so to drizzle it, then you can certainly stop. But if you do have another minute or two, particularly with color cameras, I would highly recommend drizzling, at least at a 1 time. You don't need to do 2 or 3 or whatever, but I would definitely do 1. All right, so we're at 1:05, 1:08. Let's see. This is sort of the real test here because even weighted batch preprocessing, some of this stuff goes pretty quick, and then the integration one is the one that sort of seems to be taking a long time. Looks like we're moving here pretty quick, and I bet you in the next few seconds we probably are we're done with our integration. Yep, there we go. 40 seconds to get our integration. And then drizzle will probably take another few seconds. And then we'll move on. So I'll pause there. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Hey, John, for the beginners out there, can you explain what drizzle does?
Yeah. My understanding is that it looks at, my understanding of drizzle is it looks at sort of all the surrounding pixels and tries to interpolate a higher resolution is my understanding. Now that might be directionally correct and not factually accurate, but that's my understanding. And as it comes to color imaging, when you're using a color sensor and you're using when you're using drizzling, whenever you are demosaicing or stacking an image, there's a couple different processes that the algorithm goes through, and drizzling sort of replaces one of those. And so if you do that, you're kind of getting another layer. I don't know the science behind it, but I know that it has to do with it typically improves your resolution. We're not trying to do that in this case. We're just trying to clean up some noise, and that's why we're using it.
Thanks.
Okay, so we're at 248. Let's see here.
A question here.
Yes.
I saw that you had a exposure mismatch between the dark and the light. Would it be better if you had 5-minute exposure on the darks too, to match what the light exposures are?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. So typically you'll want darks and you'll want your flats. You may want biases depending upon the type of camera that you're using. I didn't do darks. I used dark flats, which is essentially taking a flat frame and whatever the exposure length was for the flat frame, I took a dark to mimic that. So I'm calibrating my flats using those. It is best practice to also have a dark frame in order to detect hot pixels and things like that matches the length of your light exposure. So yes, absolutely. I should have done that. I didn't. I can't go back in time. I guess I could go back in time, but typically it's been a while. Dark frames are pretty good. Typically you can keep them for 6 months or so. I took these pictures a long time ago, and so the characteristics of my camera may have changed. So I just didn't do it. All right, so I'm done here processing 3 minutes and 36 seconds to stack my image. And so now what I'll do, everything looks fine. Let's exit this. I'm going to go over and find my master, and I'm going to grab my drizzle right here. I will pull that over. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and stretch this. And so before I do that, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to load sort of all my process icons. I don't need to do that. You could go up here into processes, and you could go find the ones that you want every single time. That's totally fine. Nothing wrong with that. So in this case, if I wanted to go to screen transfer function, I could pull that up, and then and sort of stretch my image. Now what you may have noticed is I unlinked it. So particularly with color images, you get this gray cast. And so I'm going to unlink that and restretch it just because it's not very pretty. We will fix that when we are processing the image. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and load all my process icons just for the sake of speed. And so let me go ahead and do that. I right click, I go to process icons and load process icons. Before I do that, if you want to save a process, once you open it up, you can just grab this triangle, pull it down here, call it whatever you want. And there's your process icon. And then if you get like a string of these, 5 or 6 or however many that you have, and you want to save those, you can just right click, and then you can go to process icons, and you can hit save process icons, type in the name that you want, and you're good. And so next time when you're ready to load them, you just right click, process icons, load process icons. And I have different sets depending on what I'm doing. I'm using one shot color tonight, so I'll just highlight one shot color, OSC, and I'll hit open. And it's going to load sort of the process icons that I use. And so that's kind of how I do it. Everybody does it their own way. Some people like a very clean sort of desktop here, and they go through each one, and that's cool too. So these are just the ones that I use most frequently when I'm doing this type of processing. The other thing that I typically do, and this is because I learned to process images using Photoshop, and so Photoshop is sort of a destructive process. Is that I've gotten into the habit of sort of saving things along the way. You don't really need to do that here in PixInsight, but I do anyway. And the way I do it is I just grab an image here and I pull it over, and now I've made I've made a copy of it. So I will minimize the other one and I'll just set that up here. And so what I'll do is, as I process my image, I'm just sort of going to build sort of these layers. They're not layers, that's a Photoshop term, but I'm going to sort of build, I keep copies, or if you will, steps along the way. So if I want to go back, I can just kind of go back and use an earlier version. The other way to do it is I can just hit the little back button up here and go back in time. But for now, this is what I'm going to do. Let's just make this a little bit bigger so that you can see it. Now that I've stretched it, the first thing that I want to do is crop it. You can kind of go through and look at your edges to see kind of how much you want to crop it. You know, zoom in and kind of look down here. It looks like I have some stacking artifacts. It might be hard to see on Zoom, but you can kind of see some stacking artifacts over here, kind of on the corners here. And so, but generally I'm looking pretty good. So I don't need to crop too much, but I'll go ahead and crop a little bit. There I just bring up dynamic crop, and then I'll just go to bring the corners in here a little bit, and that works for me. And then I hit the little green check mark button to check that. And so I'm done with that. And so my image is looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'll call that crop. I'm going to make a clone of it, and I'll bring that and I'll drop crop over here. You don't need to do any of this. Some people will just open one image and they'll process that image straight through, and that's totally okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I like to have sort of a record. All right, so now that I've sort of cropped my image, the first thing that I do is I do some gradient correction. There's several ways you can do it. PixInsight has this gradient correction tool, which is great. It's a relatively new tool. I think it came out earlier this year. You can play with these sliders here, and you just grab the bar and you pull it over, and it sort of does its thing in the background. I think it worked good sometimes. Honestly, when I'm processing new data, I typically use 3 different gradient tools, and I see the one that sort of seemed to have worked the best. And so gradient correction works sometimes. There's the old school way, dynamic background extraction, which I end up using probably 60 or 70% of the time. But you can open that up and it drops these boxes, and you can just click and drop boxes. You generally don't want to put your boxes on your nebulosity. You want to try to avoid stars if you can. You can move boxes by just sort of dragging them and things like that. But once you do that, you can kind of hit your check box here and do it that way. And then there's the way that is super easy that a lot of folks are using, and I think it's great. And so that's Graxpert. It works great too. And so it's kind of a one button push solution. I think it works really, really good on stretched data. So if you forget to do this along the way and you don't want to go back and you're doing it on stretched data, I think Graxpert is exceptional. So in this case, I'm going to leave, I'm going to kind of leave the defaults here. I like to make sure that my smoothing is all the way at 1, but otherwise sort of I leave it alone. At some point, when we go to denoise our image, we can also check this box and denoise. I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to leave that alone. But I'm going to come over here and I'm going to drag it and let it do its thing here. It's pretty quick. And here we go. It shows us a couple things here. One is sort of the model that it used, and you can see all this gradient going on in here. And then you can see sort of our resulting image. And so if I pull this up and sort of show the before and after, you might be able to see the gradient that it corrected. So now let's just make a copy of that. Move that over here. Let's go ahead and expand this. And so now that we've done sort of our gradient, the next thing that I do is I use BlurX. If you don't have BlurX, you can skip it. I think it's fantastic. It sharpens your stars. It sharpens sort of your nebulosity. If you have some aberrations, like some tilt or some back focus issues or anything like that in your imaging train, and or maybe your tracking wasn't spot on or anything like that, then BlurX, it can literally do miracles. It can fix a lot of that stuff. And so I think it's great. And this data is looking pretty good. My stars look like they're pretty round here. It looks like I have, pretty good detail, but still BlurX I think is worth running here. So I'm going to leave it on the defaults, and I'm just going to drag it and pull it over here. it runs pretty quick. For me, depending upon the camera that I'm using and the resolution of the camera, BlurX and StarX and all these other things can take a long time. I have a higher resolution camera, ASI 6200, and it takes a long time. I mean, it can take 9 or 10 minutes sometimes to run some of these processes. But with the ASI, it goes pretty quick, and so it's typically, I don't know, 45 seconds to a minute and a half. But your mileage may vary depending upon sort of your file size and things like that. And so here we're about halfway through, and then we'll kind of move on here. But is there any questions on any of this so far? Nope. Okay. So after we'll let this run here for a second, but after we sort of do sort of this BlurX, and we'll take a look at it. We'll take a look at the stars, and we'll see kind of what improvements that gave us. Then this is the part where I kind of go out of order a little bit. I normally stretch at that phase. Some people do noise first, and a lot of times in new data, I kind of will do both and see which one sort of worked for me. On this data, I find that going ahead and stretching it first and then applying noise sort of works. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So now that BlurX is completed, let me just zoom in here so that we can see maybe some of these stars. And I'm going to go, this is after and this is before. This is after and before. And so you can see sort of it really kind of brought those stars down. And if you kind of go over here to some of the details, again, I don't know if this is coming through Zoom, but it is sharpening up some of the details of this nebulosity right in here. So I'm really happy with that. I'm going to retitle this BlurX, and I'll make a clone here. I'll save this over. And now I'm ready to stretch. There's lots of different ways that you can stretch. You can use a tool like this, generalized hyperbolic stretch, and you can do it that way. You can use your curves, and you can sort of stretch by bringing your data up and moving these curves up like this, and that's okay. I like to go ahead and use a script. And the script that I use is by SETI Astro, and it's just called this statistical stretch. When I do that, there's a couple things that I want to point out. One, make sure you unlink it. If you don't, then you can get a green, like kind of a green image. You can hit your preview refresh down here, and you can kind of see what it's going to look like. And then I do this automatic convergence, which seems to work for me a little bit better in terms of the stretching. You can do it with and without and see which one works. A lot of this stuff is trial and error, but it's pretty quick. So I'm going to go ahead and execute it, and boom, it's done. So my stretch is done, and I'm pretty happy with that stretch. It looks pretty good. It didn't blow any of my highlights out. My stars look pretty tight still. My dark areas came out pretty well, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to call this stretch, and I'll make sort of a copy of that, move it over here. So far, none of the magic has happened yet, right? So we're still kind of doing sort of our image where it's very red, but that's going to change in just a second. So here, I'm going to apply a little bit of noise reduction. This is to taste. In terms of how much noise, I think the default may even be all the way at 1. I'm not a fan of the look that gives me, so I typically bring it down to 70 or 75, which I'm going to do here, and I'll pull that over and to get rid of some of this noise. And but again, there's no right or wrong, and sometimes you can always do more, so you can always start off pretty conservatively and just do a little bit and then come back and do a little bit more, or you can undo it and do it again. So none of this stuff is point of no return type stuff. So I know for this image that 0.75 seems to work pretty well for me, so that's kind of what I'm doing here. I normally do it at this stage before I remove the stars, which is kind of what we're going to do next. Now, I used NoiseX, but you don't have to do that. You can use GrAxpert too. So you can reopen GrAxpert, you can click on denoising, right? You don't need to do the background extraction, that's already been done, and you just drag this over and you can do it that way too. So both of them seem to work pretty good. So I'm going to scroll in here for just a second and zoom in. And so you can see sort of the noise reduction. That's before. I don't know how much this is showing up, but this is after, and it's much cleaner. So that's before and that's after. So pretty happy with that. So this is sort of my this is my noise. Change my name here. And then I'm going to move this off to the side. And now I'm going to remove my stars. Now, I like to remove my stars before I do my Hubble palette, create my Hubble palette with this synthetic green. And the reason why I do that is because I like my stars to have sort of a natural color. Right now they have that. Now, granted, they only have hydrogen and oxygen, right? So you kind of have red and blue, but you're not creating colors where they don't exist. You're not using a false color and applying that to your stars. So I like to remove my stars first before I do that. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Star Exterminator. If you can use StarNet as well. I actually don't have it, but it's a free tool, and it works just like this. You open it up and you essentially apply it. I'm going to unscreen my stars. And I'm going to move this over. Generate star image is what I want to do. And I'll just move this over and let sort of it do its thing. There's another box here that says large overlap. And that has to do with the number of tiles it's using when it's removing the stars. And so right now it creates sort of these tiles or boxes on your image, and it analyzes those, determine what's a star, and sort of pulls it out. And some images that have lots of detail, or they have lots of very high contrast HDR, very bright areas. Sometimes it can get confused and it can try to take some of that out, or it might leave it in. And so if you use this large overlap, what it does is it increases these tiles overlap. So you're processing some of the data twice when it's looking at it. It works great, and it seems to fix a lot of those issues. We don't have it in this data, but if you have something very sort of high contrast, that can happen. It takes longer though. It takes about twice as long. But sometimes you'll need to do that. Whenever I remove the stars from all my Milky Way photos and process the nebulosity and then put the stars back, and I almost always have to use large overlap. Otherwise, big pieces of my Milky Way are missing. So here we go. So I removed the stars. And so one thing that I like to do right off the bat is sort of fix my stars. And so if I zoom in, you can see there's this sort of green color cast. And so I'd like to remove that. The tool that I use is CNR. So I open that up. I leave it at its default. You can see, watch what happens here when I pull this over. It sort of takes that green out. I also like to remove the magenta, which is opposite of green. And so you can hit Control-I and invert your image, and then remove the green, which is sort of the magenta. Hit Control-I and take the sort of the green and the magenta out. So now I'm looking pretty good. I think the stars look good. I think sort of we still have color in our stars. We can saturate those separately if we want, and so those look pretty good. So I'm going to call that stars. And I'll shrink that and just sort of set it off to the side over here, because we're going to need to put those back later. Okay, so now here's the fun part. We're going to essentially turn this into an image that looks sort of like a Hubble palette. And there's a couple ways that we can do it. We can open up Pixel Math and we can type in a bunch of expressions to sort of create that synthetic green. Or we can cheat and we can use a process that Bill Blanchard developed and made it free for everybody, called NB normalization. And so this is one of the repositories in order to get this that I had in the slides. And so once you have this tool, it's amazing. What you do is you pull this up. What you want to do is a couple things. One, make sure that your palette is set to HOO if you're using a dual narrowband filter. You can also do this with mono narrowband images, with show images and stuff like that. In that case, what you would want to do is you'd want to choose show, right? Or if you put the files, if you put the channels, if you map them differently to the red, green, and blue, you can do hydrogen, sulfur, oxygen. or hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, what have you. In this case, we're using a one-shot color camera. We're using a dual narrowband filter. And so that is mapped to the HOO. So we're going to say HOO. We're going to leave these default for now, but we're going to talk about them in a second. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hit our little circle here to see a preview of the image. So this is not changing anything. This is just a preview of what we can see. So we click on that and boom, there we go. So now what we've done is we've created sort of this synthetic green layer, and we have created our synthetic Hubble image. So this looks pretty cool just right out of the box. There's a couple things that we can do to sort of tweak this. And if we look over here to our tool, one of the things that we can do is we can add a luminance layer. And so we can add sort of the hydrogen alpha as the luminance. And so that looks kind of neat sometimes. And so you can see sort of the difference here. It's very slight, but it adds a little bit more contrast. You can add oxygen, which will look kind of funny because the oxygen channel is not very strong. And so I would recommend not doing that. You can preserve the brightness, and so that you're not adjusting the brightness of the image. What I typically do is I leave it on off or hydrogen alpha as sort of my luminance. In this case, I'll just sort of leave it off. The other thing that you can do is you can choose between 3 modes and how much and how that synthetic green is created, how much of the hydrogen channel and how much of the oxygen channel is used. And so there's 3 sort of defaults here: mode 1, mode 2, and mode 3. Mode 1 is what we're looking at right now, which I think represents probably 99% of sort of what most people expect the Hubble palette to look like. Mode 2 uses a lot more hydrogen, and so you can see we sort of get this, it's a bit more red color. And then mode 3 is sort of between the two. So again, it's personal preference. We're using false color at this stage, but you choose the one you want. I'm going to go with mode 1. You can also go through here and manually sort of set what you want the blending rate to be between the channels. I'm going to leave it at the default rate, and I'm going to go back to mode 1 and choose mode 1. All right, so one thing that I do like to do, particularly on images that have some oxygen data that's either weaker or I really like the aesthetic of the blues, is you can go through and you can boost your oxygen channel. And so you can do something crazy and really pull it up here. And if I do that, you can see it just used more of the oxygen channel, and it added a lot more blue. I don't normally go crazy like that, but sometimes I will, maybe add a point or something, and maybe 1.1. You can always go back and change it to taste, or you can even take some out if you want. You can do some adjustments here and add some contrast, reduce the brightness, things like that if you want. I don't typically do that here because there's a lot better tools, quite frankly, I think, in PixInsight that I like to use. But you can, if you want, you can kind of make some changes here. So once you have that kind of looking the way you want, you just kind of hit your square box here and you execute that. Now that we're done, we can close all this, and this is kind of what our image looks like. So let me pull up a before. Actually, let me do this. Forgot to make a clone. Okay, so we can see sort of our before and after. So this is without that synthetic green channel, and this is sort of after. You can kind of see the difference here. And this is the only thing when I showed in the slides, the difference between the two, this is the only difference that I made. Otherwise, the processing was the same between the two. So let me go ahead and move this over here, and we will sort of continue on. Make a clone. And all I'm doing is I'm just saving versions of that. Again, don't need to do any of this. This is just so, like, if I get to the end and I realize I wanted to go down a different path, I could just kind of go and choose where I think I could go differently. So now, once I'm here, I kind of want to add a little bit of contrast. It's completely up to you. It's personal taste. There's lots of different ways to do that. I'll use this generalized hyperbolic stretch. You can use the histogram. You can use curves. I'll use this tool. I think it's great. You can use it for lots of different things. And so what I'll do is I'm just going to add a little bit of contrast by bringing sort of the black point in a little bit. The first thing I'll do is I'll open up my preview screen here. I'm going to change it from the transformation type. I'm going to change that to linear. And then I'll just reach up here and I'm going to grab this little arrow down here and I'm going to bring it pretty close to my histogram. And so I don't want to clip the blacks too much. You can come down here where it says low clip and try to keep those keep that number very low. So ideally, I guess all zeros, but 0.00002 is pretty low. So I'm not clipping a whole lot of data. Generally, I'm a bit aggressive at this stage, and so I think that that's probably working for me. And so I'll go ahead and execute that. And then what I like to do is I might want to stretch it a little bit more at this stage. Again, it's personal preference. One way to do that using this tool is you typically want to set your symmetry point. A quick way to cheat is sort of find sort of a dark area of your image. You can click on it. You can see it changes this yellow line or orange, whatever color that line that is. And so if I choose a dark area that sort of tends to put it sort of in the middle of my histogram, then I just hit send to SP and that sort of locks it in. And then I can come down here to this stretch factor and very gently sort of pull this up a little bit. And so you can sort of see before and after. If you're doing something that has a very bright area of nebulosity, then you may want to take down your local intensity. You can also sort of change your symmetry point a little bit by bringing it up or back or however you want. And so all I'm trying to do is add a little bit of contrast to this sort of image here. Again, this is before, this is after. So I added, it's a little bit brighter. Let's bring our darks down a little bit, and that works for me. So I'm going to go ahead and execute that and close all this stuff out. So now I feel pretty good about this image. You may want to add some saturation. At this point, it's really it's fine tuning some things, and then we'll add our stars back. And so when I add saturation, certainly you can go through and open up saturation, create your preview and sort of bring your bar here and sort of pull this up and go crazy and do things like that. That's a lot. That's one way to do it. What I typically like to do is I like to limit what I'm saturating to the nebulosity only. And so I will typically make a mask at this stage. You don't have to do that. It's completely up to you. For years, I didn't. For years, I just sort of added saturation and sort of called it a day. It doesn't take long to sort of create a mask. I think this image would benefit from it, where I'm only adding some saturation to my nebulosity and not necessarily the background. The way I do that is I click this little button up here that says extract CIE. Presumably that L means luminance, but if you click that, it sort of creates sort of this black and white image right here. And so what I like to do at this point is you can just use that as a mask and you can just apply that, but I typically don't. What I'll do at this point is I'll use my curves and by the way, if you don't ever see your histogram when you open up your curves tool or your generalized hyperbolic stretch or any of those, you can just click this little green check mark button down here and sort of it drops your histogram on. But typically what I'll do at this point, I'll create my preview and I'll just stretch the heck out of it. So I do something crazy, sort of like that. And I'm going to do that a couple times to really sort of blow that out to make sure that I really get sort of my nebulosity, and that works for me. So that's just in that. Now I'm going to want to blur this a little bit, and so I'll go to processes and I'll go convolution, fancy way of saying blur, and I'll look at my real-time preview. And the way you blur is you just take this standard deviation, you just sort of drag that over. This is to taste. And all we're doing is creating a mask so that we're only adding saturation to our nebulosity and not our background. So whatever you want to do. Typically, you're going to want to be at least 30 or so, but it doesn't matter. If you pull this all the way over, then you can kind of get a really blurry image. So I think for this purposes, somewhere in this range works for me. I'm going to go ahead and execute that and close my preview. Now I've got my mask. And so what you do with your mask is you need to attach it to your image here. And in PixInsight, the way you do that is you just grab it and pull it over, and you just drop it right below sort of your image. I will minimize the mask, and you can see my mask is applied. It's got this red. Everything that's red is being protected. And so now I will open up my saturation tool, open up my preview, and what I can do is when I increase my saturation by just sort of bringing this line up here, I am not adding anything to the back. I'm only adding sort of saturation to sort of the nebulosity. So that works for me. I just add a little bit. I did it across the board, which means I saturated every color equally. That's one way to do it. Using this tool, another way to do is say, hey, you know, I really like the blue. I want to leave this color alone here, but I like the blue. And so where is that? I can just sort of click. I'm using my left mouse button. I'm clicking on my blue here, and I see where that that point is over on my chart here. And so I know that's where blue is. So then I just create a couple dots around that area. Let's just double check and see that's where it's at. Yep, that's where it's at. So then I just grab this line and I pull it up, and now I'm only saturating sort of that blue. So you can, or if I want to desaturate it, I could take some away. It's up to you, but you can sort of fine tune it that way. There's lots of ways that you can add some saturation. This is the way I do it. I'm going to go ahead and apply that. I think it looks great. Let's just go close all that. The other way you can do it is you can open up curves, and you can click this little button here with the S, and you can add saturation that way. Remember to open your preview. You can grab your line here and you can saturate that way. So there's a couple different ways that you can do it. Whichever way you're comfortable with is fine. Now, one thing that you could do, and this is helpful if you have some gradients that you didn't get rid of, which, well, a lot of times you'll start to discover at this stage in your processing where you thought you got rid of them. You used, you know, DBE or Graxpert or whatever, but maybe it didn't correct everything, and it's typically always in one channel, and it'll drive you crazy. It'll be, you know, in the oxygen or the sulfur or something, and you'll have this bizarre sort of cast off to the side, and this is where you can sort of mask some of that at this stage. So I still have my mask applied. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to hit mask, and I'm going to go to invert mask. And I'm going to do the exact same process that I just did. I'm going to hit my preview, open up my saturation tool, but instead of adding saturation, I'm going to pull it down. And if you have some gradient issues, sometimes this can hide those, right? And so I don't know that it's strictly gradient correction, but it can hide them, particularly if you have a gradient issue in only one channel, and maybe the moon was up when you were shooting your oxygen or something like that. And so I'm going to just add a little bit. I'm just going to take away some of the saturation from my background here. Since I have it open, go ahead and execute that and close everything out. Once I'm done with that, I want to remove my mask. I do that by right-clicking. I hit mask, remove mask, and here we go. And so at this point, it's up to you whether you want to add some more contrast using curves. If you wanted to do that, you can open up your curves tool. Look at your real-time preview, add your histogram, and you can go crazy, you know, and do whatever you want to do. I'm not going to do that. I think we're looking pretty good so far. So now I'm ready to take a look at the stars. And so I've got my star image here, and I'm actually pretty happy with that. But let's say that I think that the stars are too dim. I really like stars, and I want more stars, and I want my stars to be brighter or something, or I want them to be dimmer or something like that. Then you can go over here to say curves, for example, and open up your preview, and you can sort of take your curve here, and you can dim them, right? You can pull this down a little bit to bring those back a little bit, or if you just want them to go crazy, you can sort of move it up like this. I generally I like stars. I think they look great. They're natural, and so generally speaking, I don't do a whole lot. But so in this case, I'll leave those alone. But just recognize that there is a tool to sort of brighten them or bring them down if you want. So I'll leave those alone for now, and I want to add my stars back to my image here. And so I want to put this is what I want to do. I want to sort of put these together. There's a couple ways to do that. There's the super duper easy way, and you just, well, first let me do this. Let me rename this to starless. You can open up Pixel Math, and the way that folks were doing it for a long time is you can just say stars plus, starless, and you can execute that, and it'll sort of put them together. I'm not a huge fan of doing it that way. I don't like the way the stars look when it goes that way. So there's a pretty complicated formula that you can type. It looks something like this, where it's tilde, and you type in this long starless, right? And you type this in. So I'm not going to do that now because I've cheated, and once I typed it in once, I saved it. So, and the way I did that is I opened it up, I typed in this formula right here, and then I just grabbed my little triangle and I pulled it off to the side, and then I called it rescreen stars, and I saved it. So I don't have to type it in every time, but essentially you type this formula in right here. You kind of open this up. I want to make sure that I am creating a new image. I'm not replacing my target image. I'm creating a new one. But otherwise, I'm ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and just execute that, and boom, there we go. So I've got sort of my starless and my stars sort of image. At this point, and if I go through one more time, so if I go through here and I said, yeah, the stars, I really just don't like how they look, then I can go through and I can adjust the stars here, like I said, and then just do it again. Now, one thing that I neglected to mention that I should point out, the reason why I titled these images starless and stars is because that's what I have typed in here. If this was image 4832, then you would need it to say tilde, image 3842, right? And if the stars was called stars clone 1 or something like that, then you would need to, so you just need to make sure that your names match so it knows to grab the right image here. So this is it. So so I'm kind of generally I would be done at this point. I would hit file, save as, and I'd save it as a TIFF or whatever I would want to do, and call it a day. Like I said, I don't stop there. I bring it over into Photoshop, and I do a couple things in Photoshop, which I will do in just a second, but I've been talking a while, so I want to stop for a second and see if there's any questions.
One thing I wanted to ask about is when you did the star removal with Star Exterminator, I noticed that you checked the de-screen option or something like that. Is that important for later recombining the image or not?
Yes. So I do it primarily because I use this process. Well, there's two things. One, when I'm doing it in PixInsight, I use this process, this algorithm here to add them back, which makes for a more natural combination of your stars when you add them back to your star image. If you don't use rescreen stars, let me just pull it up. Let's just look at it. If you don't do that, if you don't use this unscreened stars, then when you recombine them, your stars will look a little not oversaturated, but they'll look bloated. They won't look as natural. And so so I use the unscreen process, and then I use this algorithm. When I use in Photoshop, and I combine them in Photoshop, which I'll do in a minute. I'll bring the starless image and the stars image into Photoshop, and I'll combine them in Photoshop. I'll use the screen function in Photoshop in order to combine them back. And I find that works better. You don't have to. You can leave that unchecked, and you can pull the images apart without doing that. But I find that the stars look a bit better when you combine them if you check this box and if you use this formula here.
Cool, thank you. Hey, Len.
Are you familiar with the SETI Astro or rather the toolbox, has a combined image script that is perfect for this. It gives you the ability to have both images there, and you can control the saturation of color and the intensity of each image, and you can see the result in your final before you in a preview.
Yeah, I have used that. I think it's great. There is also there's another thing that you can do. Star reduction also does that. I think those are great tools, and I think they're very helpful. And that's a good way to do it with a kind of a one click. And so I agree with you. I can't remember if it is under utilities.
Toolbox. Oh, the one you're talking about?
Yeah, here it is. Where is it? There is narrowband to star colors. That's a cool one. No, the one you're talking about, I know what you're talking about. It's a great tool to adding the
It's toolbox, and in the toolbox, combine images.
Yeah, I guess I don't have that one.
Oh,
Yeah, there is one that it's focused on the stars. I thought I had it. I don't have it. I don't have it. But yeah, there's certainly there's a script that will do that for you as well.
Could you send out where you get all these tools from,
Yeah.
like links so that I can get them in my PixInsight?
Yes. So what I'll do is I have created a text file, and I will the text file has all the repositories in it, and I'll share it. I'll share it with everybody. You can just download you can download the text files, and that's nice because you can just copy and paste rather than manually typing in sort of the long repository. So yeah, I'll share that. I'll share that with everybody, so you can copy paste it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and bring these over into Photoshop. The way I do that is this will go pretty quick, but I'll just hit Save As. This is sort of my starless. I'm going to do it. Let me just make sure I put it in the right place so I can find it. So this is my starless. I save it as a TIFF. I want to save it as a 16-bit. Hit OK. I'm going to do the same thing with stars. File, Save As. Stars, I want to save it as a TIFF. Hit save. 16-bit. Hit OK. At this point, I normally shut down PixInsight. Before I do that, I like to hit File, Save Project, and sort of choose where I'm going to save my project, and type in my name and sort of save my project. So that's typically, and then at that point, I will sort of shut that down. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Photoshop real quick. Let me just make sure my files are where I think they are, and they are. And so again, I do this on almost all of my images, and you don't have to do this. We're pretty much done, but there are a couple really quick things that I like to do. I go File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, Browse. And I'm going to go find my files here. So here we go. Those are my two. I'll highlight those two, hit OK. I don't need to align them. I don't need to create a smart object. I just need to hit OK. And that's going to drop these into sort of a stack. Let me just move here we go. And so I've got my stars, and I've got my starless image. And I can they're in layers now. And so I can, what I can do here is I will use the screen, and there's my stars, right? So one of the things that I will do at this stage, if I want to tweak my stars, if I wanted to add saturation, all those things I can do in PixInsight, then I can just go in here and create sort of a layer here. I will pin it by using this little button here to pin it to the image below it. And I can do things like make my stars super bright, or I can bring them back a little bit if I want to dim them a little bit. So maybe I wanted them just a little bit dimmer. So I can kind of go through and do it that way. If I wanted to add some saturation, I can hit, I can again add a saturation layer, and I can sort of bring up the saturation of my stars if I want to do that, or the vibrance, whatever I want to do. So that's sort of a fun tool to use there, and sort of very fine tuning and seeing real time sort of your stars without sort of doing it in PixInsight. What I'll do here is I like the camera raw tool. It's super duper easy. It's made for dummies like me. And so I will clone my image. And so what I did here is I just created a new image, and I just grabbed my image and I bring it over to the little plus button. And then I'll go to filter, camera raw. And there's some things that I might want to do in here to sort of adjust the look, right? So I can change my exposure. I'm not really interested in doing that. If I'm doing sort of a galaxy and I've blown out my core, I can bring sort of down the highlights. If I want, I can add sort of some contrast, and I can do all these in one fell swoop with some sliders. So if I feel like when you're doing some final touches near the end, I overwhelmingly use PixInsight to process my image, but at the end, when I'm doing some fine tuning, it's really helpful to very quickly kind of go through and maybe I'll add, I'll dehaze my image. I'll maybe add a little bit of clarity, add some texture. If I wanted to change sort of the color here, I can do that. I can go into color mixer, and I can sort of add or change sort of my my colors. Let me see here. Let me find a color that's represented. So I can change my blue to more sort of purple, or I can add some green. So I can do all that stuff sort of here, right? Certainly I can do things like add saturation. I like color. I like nebulosity photos that are on the cool side. So I typically will bring my color balance a little bit. And so anyway, so I'll kind of do stuff like that. And I just find that it sort of works a little bit better for me, and I can do it sort of faster in sort of Photoshop. All I've done is I've moved a couple of sliders. This is before, this is sort of after. I hit OK, and sort of that added a little bit of contrast to my image. There are other tools that you can use to add a bit of sharpness in here. You can do it in camera raw. You can do things like add masks and stuff like that. I'm not going to do that here. It's sort of beyond the scope sort of this course, but a lot of times just adding having a slider so you can just make a couple slide adjustments sort of really makes it easy to do some final touches. And so typically I'll do that and call it a day. And then once I hit that point, I will hit File, Export, and then I export as, and then save it to a JPEG or PNG, GIF, whatever I want to do. If I want to crop it, I can use the cropping tool. And there's sort of presets here: 5:7, 4:8. You can adjust those manually if you want. You can rotate the image very easily just by grabbing it and doing things like this. And so there's stuff in Photoshop just when you're fine tuning that is just really sort of easy to do. And so typically when I am pulling together an image that I want to post sort of on Instagram or something like that, I almost always do it in sort of this portrait mode. And I do that is because a lot of people are looking at the images on their phones. And so I get the most real estate for the image in portrait mode versus sort of landscape. So I almost always will rotate my image so that the orientation of the image lends itself to sort of a portrait. And then sort of I will crop it and save it off and move on. So I'll stop there and sort of go back to PixInsight and see if there are any questions.
What's your take on like being super religious about, north being up in an image, or do you just go for like what looks good visually at the end of the day?
Okay. That's a loaded question. So when I don't do things like I don't remove stars that are supposed to be there, or add stars that are not there, or add, or manipulate something like that to create something that's not there. That's kind of where I draw the line. But in terms of color, especially since you're using false color, or orientation, or anything like that, I never do, right? So I will move things around so aesthetically they look great, but I won't manipulate the image. I won't create something that wasn't otherwise there or anything. I mean, sometimes it's always fun to do that, right? It's always fun to drop a moon onto a starry landscape or something kind of crazy like that. But in terms of nebulosity photos and stuff like that, I draw the line at manipulating them to where they're not, you know, it's you're adding something or taking something away that was or wasn't there. But in terms of orientation and color and all that kind of stuff, there's no limit for me. I will,
Yeah.
you know, I will oversaturate it if I think it adds to the aesthetic, or I will desaturate. Quite frankly, I'm often desaturating images, not saturating them. In one-shot color, I'm almost always adding saturation. In mono images, I'm almost always desaturating them a little bit. In terms of orientation, though, I'll do it however I want. Now, when it comes to planets and the sun and the moon, I will correct those. So if particularly if I'm using a refractor or something like that and the image is reversed, then I always put it back the right way. Even though when you're looking through it, if you were looking through an eyepiece, you would sort of see the mirror image. I always put that stuff back, but I don't do that for nebulosity. I don't mirror images or anything.
Yep, me too. Cool.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything else? No? Okay. One thing that I might show, since it looks like maybe there's a couple minutes left here that I didn't, but I will mention it because some people do like to do it, and I kind of touched on it a little bit. Sometimes you might want to adjust the colors very specifically, and for that you would need to create a mask. And so in this Pac-Man image, I didn't really manipulate the colors a lot. I sort of let them land where they were after using that narrowband tool. But there are ways to do it. There's the way that I think is pretty easy by using sort of this script called color mask mod, which is under utilities. And here you can very quickly create a color mask. You can create a yellow one or a green one or magenta or blue. And so a lot of times when you're dealing with the Hubble palette, you might want to adjust the yellow or the green. And so right now I'll just click on yellow and here's sort of my preset. I can widen that preset by bringing these back and expanding them and stuff like that. And then I can hit OK to create a mask. You'll almost always want to blur that mask. And again, the way you do that is you use sort of convolution and just sort of bring your standard deviation up a little bit. Apply that, and then you'll apply your mask just like we did before when we were doing our saturation. And then here, if I bring up my curves, bring up my real-time preview. And remember, I've used a color, I've used a yellow, created a yellow mask. And so if I wanted to, add some red to that, I could select my red channel and sort of bring sort of my red up and add some red there. Or I could, bring some green down, bring my blue up a little bit and sort of add sort of a little bit of red. You can see sort of before and after. A lot of times you may want to do this depending upon what you're imaging. Like the Seagull Nebula is like a really good example of that. If you shoot that and you go and you start processing it, you're going to see a lot of green in there, and you'll see a lot of people, they'll have these really beautiful red and blue images and yellow, and when you go to do it, you're like, why is everything green? So for that, you'll want to create a mask and go through and sort of manipulate sort of these channels a little bit. So I didn't show that, but that's one thing that folks kind of like to do, and I will do that sometimes, particularly if there's a lot of green. I don't much care for green in my images, and so I will typically select yellow or green mask and go through and manipulate those. So I should have mentioned that before, but that's one little sort of trick too. Okay.
Cool. Thanks so much, John. I learned a few tricks there. Like I had never seen the color saturation process before somehow, so I'm going to be using the heck out of that. That's cool.
Yeah, I use curves a lot. I think that the using curves to add saturation works really well too. I think the color saturation tool here is a bit softer. It's not quite as aggressive, and so if you just want to add a little bit of saturation or you want to pull a little bit back, I think it's a great tool. You can always do more and more and more and more, right? And I think the curves is great too. A lot of people I think use probably the curves tool. But yeah, I think it's nice. The only thing to remember to do is you need to add some dots if you want to do a very specific color. Otherwise, when you pull it up, you're gonna pull, you'll pull everything that you don't have a dot at, right? So let me reset that. Like if you just go and try to pull up blue,
Right.
you're gonna pull the whole curve up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like a lot of times I just want to enhance the blue, and that's an easy way to do it. So
Yeah.
that's a really cool trick. Hey, if anyone wants to follow your work, you said you're on Instagram. Do you want to plug your channel real quick?
Oh yeah, I do. I have to go look up and see what I don't even remember what my name is. I always forget. Oh, John Star Photography is my Instagram. Is my Instagram. And so I do deep sky, but I do a lot of wide field, a lot of landscape photography, a lot of screenshots. So I'm a fan of all things sort of photography. So
Absolutely. Any last questions before we wrap up here?
Yeah, actually, I had one, John. The when you did the drizzle of one, is that just you only do that for color data like this, or do you do it for mono too?
Well, I do it for mono, but I have not found a significant advantage. So I always use weighted batch preprocessor unless I want to do something quick like tonight. And I always then go have lunch or dinner or whatever and come back an hour later while it's running, right? And so I might as well go ahead and do drizzle. And I always go do a drizzle of one. And but I don't typically find in my mono images, I don't typically see sort of the bang for the buck, right? The big difference in sort of noise reduction that I do with one shot color. In one shot color, I mean, I can, you know what? Well, since we're sitting here, I'll just pull it up because we did it, right? So let me just, I'll pull up the two and we can take a look and hopefully it'll come through on Zoom. But you can see sort of the noise reduction between sort of the two images. So here's the undrizzled. Let me just pull that up. And it's okay. So this is sort of my normal image here, and then here is the drizzled. And I don't know. You guys will tell me if it comes through. I can see it for sure. So this is drizzle. Let's do this. Let's cheat. Let's call it. Right. So now we definitely know. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to flash between these two, and you can sort of see the difference. So this is not drizzled. This is drizzled. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. We'll do something like this. I think this is how you do it. It's been a long time since. There we go. I remembered how to do that. Okay, so this is without drizzle, and this is drizzling. I don't know if you can see it on Zoom. I can definitely see it. I can definitely see there's a lot more noise. There's a lot of color noise that I'm not seeing in the drizzled. So the resolution is the same, but it is a much cleaner image. And so if you're using a one-shot color camera, I always drizzle. And again, I'm not doing drizzle 2 or 3 or whatever. All I'm trying to do is clean up the noise, Wes.
Mhm.
Cool.
I wonder if the drizzling is happening before or after the debayering, because it might just have something to do with that bear pattern. I don't know.
Yeah, when I was learning PixInsight and learning about stacking and all that, there was a fair amount of posts recommending drizzle, and they didn't really go into why. But then I found on the PixInsight website there is a white paper on the science behind it, and I mean I started to read it and I'm like, oh man, I think I'm gonna stick with it works better as the answer rather
The
than
same thing. I think it was a post from the actual developer of PixInsight that like recommended, well, just do a drizzle of one. You'll feel better about it. And
yeah, and he's right. But I am not seeing the same bang for your buck on mono. And so I always do it because I'll be gone for an hour anyway while it's stacking, but I don't really see the difference.
cool.
Also a new trick I learned tonight. Cool.
All
All
right.
right. Any last questions? Chirp, chirp. All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this tonight, John. That was awesome. Very well done. And again, if anyone's watching this and you're in the Central Florida region, do consider joining us at cfas.org. Again, there's a link in the description. Thanks so much, John. We'll be following your work. And I'm going to hit the stop recording button. Thanks so much.